Hello everyone and welcome back. We are continuing our journey into IFRS 16 leases, and if you remember from our last lecture, we discussed the definition of a lease contract. Quick refresher for all of us. A lease contract is a contract that conveys the right to use of an identified asset from one party, that is lessor, to another party, that is lessee, for a period of time in exchange for consideration. In our last discussion, we identified 4 key terms in that definition. Number 1 is identified asset, number 2 is right to use, number 3 is lease payment, and number 4 is period of time. Today, we are focusing on one of the key terms, that is the right to use. This concept is at the heart of a lease contract, and understanding it is crucial. So pay attention, my friends. IFRS 16 tells us that when a lessor transfers the right to use of an identified asset to the lessee gets 2 important rights over the asset. One is the right to obtain substantially all the economic benefits from using the asset, and the second is the right to direct the use of the asset. Let's break this down one by one. The first right is the right to obtain economic benefits from use. Now, what does this mean? When we talk about economic benefits, we are talking about the value or the profit you can gain from using the asset. Basically, there are 2 main ways you can get economic benefits from an asset. Number 1, by using the asset, and number 2, by selling the asset. But listen to me carefully, my friends. In a lease contract, the right to use does not include the right to sell the asset. You only have the right to use it and enjoy the benefits it brings. So if you can use the asset, whether it's a machine, a truck, or a building, and gain its economic benefits, even if you cannot sell it, you have got the first right covered. For example, if you lease a truck, you can use it to transport goods, and that's how you gain the economic benefits. And the second right is the right to direct the use of the asset. Now, this is the second part of the right to use and a very important one. When we say direct the use of the asset, what does that mean? It means you, the lessee, have the power to decide when to use the asset, where to use the asset, and how to use the asset. In other words, you are in charge of how that asset is operated. If you can control these decisions, you meet the criteria for having the right to direct the use of the asset. Let me remind you of the example from our last lecture. Remember the truck scenario? If you rent a truck, you load the inventory, you decide which route to take, at what speed to drive, and when to drive. This means you are in full control of how the truck is used. So you have the right to direct the use of that truck, and that's a lease contract. On the other hand, if you hire a transportation service to move your goods, you are not controlling the truck. The transportation company makes the decision. This is a service contract, not a lease, because you don't have the right to direct the use of the truck. So the key takeaway here is, to have the right to use, you need to have both the ability to obtain economic benefit from using the asset and the ability to direct how the asset is used. Are we clear on that, my friends? Excellent. Now, my friends, let's dive a bit deeper into this concept of right to use, especially when there are certain restrictions in place. IFRS 16 mentions something called protective rights, and these are important to understand when evaluating a lease contract. So what exactly are protective rights and how do they impact the right to use of an asset? Let me explain this with a simple example. Suppose you rent a car from a car rental company and they impose a condition that you cannot drive the car outside the boundaries of Washington. This condition is what we called a protective right. The car rental company is protecting their asset by restricting its use to a specific area. But here is the key part. Even though you cannot drive the car outside Washington, you still have full control over how to use the car within the city, within the Washington. You decide when to use the car, where to drive within Washington, and how to operate the car. This means you still have the right to direct the use of the car. The protective right simply places some boundaries, but it does not take away your ability to make decisions about the car's use. IFRS 16 clearly states that having protective rights in a lease contract does not cancel out the right to use the asset. Let's look at another example. Imagine you lease a piece of plant and machinery and the owner says you can only produce up to 100,000 units a day and you cannot operate the machine for more than 10 hours a day. This is another form of restriction or protective right. However, within these limits, you still get to decide when to start using the machine, how many units to produce as long as it is under 100,000, and how you operate it within the 10-hour window. So even with these restrictions, you are still in charge of how and when to use the machine. This means you have the right to direct the use of the asset, which fulfills the second right under the right to use criteria. To summarize, my friends, even if a lease contract contains protective right, it does not prevent you from having the right to use the asset, as long as the two main rights are transferred. Number one, the right to obtain substantial economic benefits through use, and number two, the right to direct the use of the asset. Then the right to use criteria are still met. Alright, I hope that clears things up. In the next section, we will continue exploring more important terms and the conditions in the lease contract. For now, let's wrap up today's discussion here. Thank you for your attention and I will see you in the next session.